All right, let's go ahead and pause for the notes here today. So yesterday we talked about national unrest, and that's what the bell ringer was about that you typed in Canvas chat. The document-based question, hopefully you had a time to get through most of that. Remember for the first and second documents, answer the questions, what is the main idea? And what are three pieces of evidence that support that? And then don't forget to do the questions at the bottom. What is the historical context of the documents? How are they similar and how are they different? In the notes, we are on European supremacy. So today we'll talk about some of the population changes and also the rising industry that occurs. In Europe. So, let's talk about European supremacy. So, population trends and migration. The population will rise in Europe until about 1910 when it starts to level off. And there'll be some factors for that. Obviously, there'll be, and by the end of that decade, there'll be disease and there'll be World War One. But also, it's because as standard of living increases, people tend to have less children, especially as they have more access to hospitalization and medicine and birth control and things like that. But anyway, population rates will continue to rise and lead to some food shortages, especially in Eastern Europe. And people will continue to move from rural to urban areas. Because of this, between 1846 and 1932, 50 million people will end up leaving Europe to travel to different places that are parts of the various empires that existed during the imperial era. And here you can see a map of some of the transference of people from Europe to North America in particular. That's probably the biggest shift that happens, especially from Ireland and other places, but also some people moving to South America. You can see in the East Coast there. And then traveling around the world to go to other places, including the colonies that existed in Africa and their imperial connection to India, and so on. New industries would start to grow in what were called the Second Industrial Revolution, which concentrates on chemicals, electricity, and oil. So this will be different than the First Industrial Revolution that looked at changing especially textiles and new machinations. So this will be a little bit different, concentrating on those three things that I just mentioned. The Bessemer process in particular will make steel in a mass form and cheaply, which will help revolutionize lots of other industries. It will help expand railroads and building construction in urban areas. And so the Bessemer process is incredibly important to the Second Industrial Revolution. And also the Solway process, which is spelled Solway. The Solway process would help create new types of cleaning materials like soaps, for instance, and dyes for clothing and other types of things, and also eventually lead to the creation of plastics. And then there was electricity, which will obviously be incredibly important to revolutionizing industry by allowing a greater use of power, but also for people's standard of living as well. And it will change culture because now people will be able to stay up later with more efficient lighting. And it will start to also change people's habits. And then, of course, there's the automobile. The biggest name in Europe will be Gottlieb Daimler. Daimler is the more important name to spell there, Daimler. Daimler still exists and has been affiliating at times with American companies, but he would invent the modern internal combustion engine. And even though Henry Ford is an American, he will help revolutionize the mass production of automobiles with the assembly line. And of course, this will also lead to the greater use of oil. So industrialization is going to see output first occur in Western European countries. You can see France and Britain in particular is going to have the greatest amount of industrialization. And then by 1913, which is the map on the right, the greatest productivity, of course, once again, is still going to be Britain with the darkest color there, followed by Germany, and then also France. And then you can see some parts of Northern and Eastern Europe have gotten into it as well. But notice some of the least productivity is happening in Portugal and the Balkan states with Greece, Siberia, Bulgaria, Romania, and the Ottoman Empire. So there were economic difficulties, bad weather and foreign competition, also stagnation sometimes as industry shifted. There would also be poor working conditions that would lead to strikes and boycotts of certain businesses. And the expansion of industry and consumer demand in particular will help end some of the stagnation problems by the end of the century, so around 1890 to 1900. And so you start to see once again the middle class starting to dominate. We saw during the Enlightenment period leading up into the French Revolution, the middle class became more prominent, but then the conservative order came into effect and shifted that. But now, by the Second Industrial Revolution, you're going to see the incredible growth of the middle class once again. Owners and managers are going to be able to accumulate large amounts of wealth and start to live as good as, and in some cases, maybe even better than some aristocracy. And you're also going to see small entrepreneurs and professional people, like, for instance, those that require an education to do their jobs, doctors, lawyers, accountants, eventually teachers. They're going to become part of the middle class as well. And so they're basically, because of their skill and their higher wage, are going to be able to live a little bit better life. Not as much as the owners of production or the aristocrats, but better than they've worked before. And so they're going to be referred to as white-collar workers because of the dress shirts that they might have to wear in order to go to work. They're also referred to as the petite bourgeoisie. And they were able to spend a lot more money on consumer goods, hence the higher standard of living that they could afford. But of course, that would lead to some resentment between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the working class, later on. But because of all this productivity and change, you eventually started to see the advent of modernization of cities. And Napoleon III was incredibly concerned about Paris in particular, not because he had some kind of deep desire to necessarily improve people's lives as much as he wanted to prevent some type of radical uprising. So Paris was rebuilt for political purposes. The streets were widened so that way troops could march down them to stop any type of rioting from taking place. And eventually other types of buildings were added where others had stood, department stores, office complexes, apartments, and eventually a subway was added. And plus, venues that people could visit, for instance, and would beautify Paris and enhance its culture were added, such as the Paris Opera, obviously the Eiffel Tower, the most famous symbol of Paris, and the Basilica of the Sacred Heart, so one of their larger churches. But you would also see sometimes these facilities would once again lead to some of that class resentment, as obviously working class people were less likely to be able to afford things that were in them. And they looked at the people shopping in and the people running the department stores in particular and saw definitely a class distinction. And the Eiffel Tower wasn't necessarily like that much when it was first built. Some people saw it as ugly and metal, therefore symbolic of the industrialization that was taking over people's lives and nature. But like I said, eventually it became one of its most well-known symbols. And part of the reason that people wanted to reinvent cities is because some of the problems that we talked about earlier. disease being one of them, especially cholera, that impacted many different people through the mid 1800s. And because of the eventual discovery that it involved cleanliness of water and removal of human waste, you eventually saw investment in water and sewage systems. And that's why the Public Health Act was passed in Britain, because the government wanted to become more involved. They realized that some private properties, especially slums, encouraged unsanitary living. And if they didn't have the ability to remove waste, that of course could be a place for disease to spring up. So government started to become more involved in regulating private property. The middle class, in the meantime, saw reinvention of cities as a chance to revitalize interest in their own private owned housing instead of living in apartment buildings or above their businesses. And so middle class reformers believed that cheap, adequate housing was necessary in order to alleviate any of the types of problems that exist in society. People would be less likely to protest and riot if they had somewhere to live. But at the same time, even though there might be a push for more housing to be available in cities, the people who can afford to are now living outside them, developing in small towns around the urban areas and in the suburbs, where you would see the higher standard of living, higher property values, and could only be afforded by people in the middle class, particularly those that were part of the owning class. So let's go ahead and stop there for today. The remainder of the time, turn in the DBQ if you haven't already, or any other Unit 8 or Unit 7 assignments that you were notified about.